Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's talk about a phone call that exposed the longest-running Soviet spy operation in U.S. Navy history and destroyed an entire family. On the afternoon of November 15, 1984, Barbara Walker, a 46-year-old real estate agent living in a modest apartment in West Dennis, Massachusetts, sat at her kitchen table with a telephone receiver in her hand and a decision that had taken her months to reach. The number written on the paper in front of her was for the FBI's Boston field office. She had written it down 3 separate times over the past 4 months, and 3 times she had thrown the paper away without making the call. This time the paper remained on the table, and her finger hovered over the rotary dial. Outside, the November sky was gray and heavy with the promise of an early winter storm. Through her kitchen window, she could see the Cape Cod landscape, bare trees, empty beaches, the kind of off-season quiet that had made her choose this place after her divorce. The apartment was small but comfortable, furnished with pieces she'd accumulated over the past 7 years of living alone. On the refrigerator were photographs of her 4 daughters, all grown now, all trying to build lives that bore no resemblance to the chaos of their childhood. Barbara Walker had been divorced from her husband, John Anthony Walker, Jr., since 1976. The divorce had been bitter and complicated, involving accusations, recriminations, and a settlement that had left both parties feeling cheated. For 8 years since the divorce, Barbara had tried to build a life separate from the 20-year marriage that had ended in failure. She had gone back to school, earned her real estate license, found work selling vacation properties to summer people. She had tried to be a good mother to her daughters, though the damage from the marriage had affected all of them in ways that were still becoming clear. But the secret she had been carrying since 1967, 17 years earlier, had never left her. It had been with her through the arguments and reconciliations of her marriage, through the divorce proceedings, through every attempt she'd made to start over. And now, sitting at her kitchen table in November 1984, she had finally decided that the secret could not remain hers alone. She dialed the number. The call was answered on the 3rd ring by a receptionist at the FBI's Boston field office. Barbara identified herself and said she had information about a matter of national security. She was transferred to a duty agent. According to the FBI's records of that call, Barbara's initial statement was brief and direct. "My ex-husband has been selling secrets to the Russians for almost 20 years. The agent on the other end of the line asked for her ex-husband's name. "John Walker," she said. "John Anthony Walker, Jr. He's in the Navy, or he was. He retired a few years ago, but he's been spying since 1967. I know because I was there when it started. John Anthony Walker, Jr. had been born in 1937 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the 3rd of 4 children in a working-class Irish Catholic family. His father, also named John Walker, had worked irregular jobs, some factory work, some manual labor, periods of unemployment that created financial instability. His mother, Margaret, had been a strong-willed woman who held the family together through difficult times, but who also, according to later accounts from John Jr., had been physically and emotionally abusive. John Jr.'s childhood had been marked by poverty, frequent moves, and the kind of instability that leaves children looking for escape routes. He had not been a particularly good student, graduating from high school with unremarkable grades and no clear prospects. In 1955, at the age of 17, he had enlisted in the United States Navy. The Navy offered structure, steady income, the possibility of learning a trade, and most importantly, a way out of Scranton. He had met Barbara Crowley in 1957, when he was 20 and she was 19. Barbara had been raised in a Catholic family in Massachusetts, the daughter of a police officer. She had been working as a clerk when she met John at a social event in Boston. According to later accounts from both of them, the attraction had been immediate. John had been charming, confident, ambitious. He had talked about his plans for advancement in the Navy, about the opportunities military life offered, about the places they would go and the life they would build. They were married in May 1957. Their first daughter, Margaret, was born in 1958. Over the following years, 3 more daughters would be born: Cynthia in 1960, Laura in 1962, and Rachel in 1966. John Walker's Navy career in those early years had been relatively successful by the standards of enlisted personnel. He had been trained as a radio man, a position that involved handling encrypted communications, operating radio equipment, and maintaining communications security. It was technical work that required clearances and that offered opportunities for advancement. By the early 1960s, Walker had been promoted to Radio Man Second Class and had been assigned to various ships and shore installations. In 1966, Walker was assigned to the staff of the submarine force, Atlantic, based in Norfolk, Virginia. This was a significant assignment, as submarine communications involved some of the most highly classified information in the Navy's communications network. Walker's security clearance was upgraded to top secret with access to sensitive compartmented information, the highest level available to enlisted personnel. His duties included handling encrypted messages relating to submarine operations, nuclear weapons protocols, and naval intelligence. According to Barbara's later testimony to investigators, the Walker family's life in Norfolk during this period had appeared stable on the surface. They lived in military housing. John went to work every day. The children attended local schools. Barbara was busy managing the household and caring for 4 young daughters. But beneath this surface stability, there were serious problems. The first problem was financial. Despite John's Navy salary and Barbara's efforts to manage their expenses carefully, the family was chronically short of money. John had expensive tastes. He liked to drink at officers' clubs even though he was enlisted. He bought clothes and accessories that were beyond their budget, and he made investments in business ventures that invariably failed. By late 1967, according to court documents from their later divorce proceedings, the family was approximately $11,000 in debt, a substantial sum equivalent to roughly 2 years of John's Navy salary. The second problem was the marriage itself. John was a habitual philanderer who made little effort to hide his affairs from Barbara. He stayed out late, came home drunk, and on several occasions brought women to the family home when Barbara was away. Barbara, raised Catholic and bound by religious conviction to the sanctity of marriage, tried to hold the family together despite her husband's behavior. But the combination of financial stress and marital infidelity created an atmosphere of tension and unhappiness. It was in this context, in December 1967, that John Walker made the decision that would define the rest of his life and destroy his family. On the evening of December 14, 1967, John Walker drove alone to Washington, D.C., approximately 200 miles north of Norfolk. According to his later confession to FBI investigators, he had spent weeks planning what he was about to do. He had debated the decision, rationalized it, convinced himself that the benefits outweighed the risks. He parked his car on a residential street in northwest Washington and walked several blocks to the Soviet embassy on 16th Street Northwest. The building was a large, imposing structure that served as the official diplomatic mission of the Soviet Union to the United States. It was also the headquarters for Soviet intelligence operations in the United States, housing both KGB and GRU officers operating under diplomatic cover. Walker approached the front entrance. According to his account, he was nervous, but determined. He had rehearsed what he would say. He had prepared materials to demonstrate his access and value. At approximately 8:30 p.m., he rang the bell at the embassy's entrance. A Soviet official answered the door. Walker identified himself as a U.S. Navy radio man stationed in Norfolk and said he had information he believed would be of interest to the Soviet government. The official, according to Walker's later testimony, seemed initially skeptical, but agreed to let him inside. Walker was brought to a small office where he met with a man who introduced himself as a member of the embassy's staff. Walker presented his bona fides, his Navy identification card, documentation showing his security clearance level, and, most importantly, a manila envelope containing copies of several classified documents he had removed from his workplace. These documents included key lists for encrypted communications systems used by Navy submarines. The key lists were essentially code books that allowed encrypted radio messages to be decoded. In the 1960s, most military communications used rotor-based encryption machines similar in principle to the German Enigma machines of World War II. The security of these systems depended on regularly changing the rotor settings according to key lists that were distributed to authorized users. With access to the key lists, an adversary could read encrypted communications in real time. Walker explained his access, his financial situation, and his proposal. He would provide key lists and other classified materials on a regular basis in exchange for cash payments. According to his later statements, he told the Soviet official that he needed money immediately to pay off debts and that he expected to be compensated at a rate commensurate with the value of what he was providing. The Soviet official examined the materials Walker had brought. Then he left the room for approximately 20 minutes. When he returned, he told Walker that the Soviet Union was interested in his proposal and would arrange ongoing contact. Walker was given $2,000 in cash, described by him later as a down payment, and was told to return to Norfolk and await further contact. Walker drove back to Norfolk that same night, arriving home in the early morning hours of December 15, 1967. Barbara was awake when he returned, worried about where he had been. According to her later testimony, John initially told her he had been in Washington on Navy business, but over the following days, as she watched him pay off creditors with cash and observed his evident relief at the family's improved financial situation, she became suspicious. Approximately 3 weeks after John's trip to Washington in early January 1968, he told Barbara what he had done. According to her testimony to FBI investigators 17 years later, his explanation was matter of fact. He said he had made contact with the Soviets. He said he was providing them with communications information. He said they were paying him well and would continue to pay him. He said it was relatively safe because the material he was providing was technical in nature, key lists and encryption procedures, and that even if the Soviets used the information, it would be difficult for American counterintelligence to trace any compromise back to him specifically. Barbara's reaction, as she described it years later, was one of shock, followed by a kind of paralyzed resignation. She understood immediately that what John had done was treason. She understood that if he were caught, he would go to prison for the rest of his life. She understood that as his wife, she could potentially be charged as an accomplice if she knew about his activities and did not report them. But she also understood, or believed, that she had limited options. She had 4 young daughters. She had no independent income. She was financially dependent on John, and John made clear to her, according to her testimony, that if she reported him to authorities, he would deny everything, and she would be left alone to raise 4 children with no support. So Barbara made a choice that would haunt her for the next 16 years. She said nothing. Over the 18 years, from 1968 to 1985, John Walker provided the Soviet Union with an enormous volume of highly classified U.S. Navy communications material. The exact extent of the compromise was never fully determined, but damage assessments prepared by the Department of Defense after Walker's arrest concluded that he had provided information on virtually every aspect of Navy communications, including encryption systems, operational plans, submarine deployments, nuclear weapons protocols, and strategic targeting information. The operational mechanism was straightforward. Walker's KGB handler provided him with a sophisticated camera designed for photographing documents. Walker would remove classified materials from secure areas at his workplace, photograph them at home, return the originals to the workplace, and deliver the film to his handler through a series of dead drop sites in the Washington, D.C. area. The payments were substantial. According to Walker's own estimates, he received approximately $1 million over the 18-year period, an average of roughly $55,000 per year. This was in addition to his Navy salary and represented a significant supplemental income that allowed him to live well beyond his official means. In 1968, shortly after Walker began spying, he was transferred from Norfolk to a new assignment aboard the USS Niagara Falls, a guided missile cruiser. He continued his espionage activities during this assignment, photographing classified materials whenever the ship was in port. In 1969, he was promoted to Chief Radio Man, a senior enlisted position that gave him even greater access to classified communications. During this period, Barbara Walker was increasingly troubled by her husband's activities. According to her later testimony, John would sometimes bring classified documents home and photograph them in their garage or basement. She would hear the camera clicking late at night. She would see the packages of film that he prepared for delivery. She knew what was happening, but she felt trapped by her circumstances and by her decision to remain silent. The Walker daughters, growing up during these years, were aware that something was wrong in their family, even if they did not understand what. Their father was often absent, working long hours, or traveling on what he claimed was Navy business. Their mother was increasingly withdrawn and emotionally distant. There were arguments behind closed doors. There was a sense of secrets and tensions that the children could feel but not articulate. In 1976, after 20 years of marriage, Barbara filed for divorce. By this point, the marriage had deteriorated to the point where both parties wanted out. John had been openly maintaining relationships with other women. Barbara had been seeing a therapist and had decided she could no longer live with the situation. The divorce proceedings were contentious, involving disputes over property, child support, and custody arrangements. During the divorce, Barbara seriously considered telling authorities about John's espionage activities. According to her later statements, she consulted with a lawyer about what would happen if she reported her ex-husband for treason. The lawyer told her that she could potentially be charged as an accessory if prosecutors determined she had knowingly concealed criminal activity. This frightened her enough that she remained silent. John Walker retired from the Navy in 1976 at the rank of Chief Warrant Officer. He had served for 21 years and left with a pension and an honorable discharge. But his espionage activities did not end with his retirement. By this point, he had begun recruiting additional spies to continue providing the Soviets with classified information. The first recruit was Jerry Alfred Whitworth, Walker's friend and former shipmate. Whitworth had been a Navy radio man like Walker and had similar access to classified communications. According to later court testimony, Walker had approached Whitworth in 1975 and had gradually introduced the idea of spying for money. Whitworth, who had financial problems of his own, had agreed. Between 1975 and 1985, Whitworth provided massive amounts of classified material to Walker, who passed it on to the KGB. For this work, Walker paid Whitworth approximately $332,000, a substantial sum, but far less than what Walker himself was receiving from the Soviets. The second recruit was even more troubling: Walker's own son, Michael Lance Walker. Michael had followed his father into the Navy and had become a yeoman, an administrative position with access to classified documents. According to Michael's later testimony, his father had recruited him in 1983, when Michael was 22 years old, by explaining that he had been spying for years, that it was relatively safe, and that Michael could make substantial extra money with minimal risk. Michael Walker, who idolized his father despite the family's dysfunction, had agreed. For approximately 18 months, from late 1983 to early 1985, Michael provided classified documents to his father, who photographed them and passed them to the KGB. Michael was paid approximately $1,000 per month. Walker also recruited his older brother, Arthur, who had served in the Navy and later worked as a defense contractor with security clearance. Arthur's contributions were less significant than Whitworth's or Michael's, but he provided what he could access, motivated primarily by his relationship with his brother and by financial need. By 1985, the Walker spy ring consisted of 4 people: John Walker, Jerry Whitworth, Michael Walker, and Arthur Walker, all providing classified information that flowed through John to the KGB and from there to Soviet military intelligence. Barbara Walker's decision to finally contact the FBI in November 1984 came after years of internal struggle and after specific events that convinced her she could no longer remain silent. The first factor was her daughter Laura. Laura Walker, born in 1962, had grown up in the chaos of her parents' troubled marriage and had struggled throughout her teenage years with depression and behavioral problems. In 1984, Laura told her mother that she knew, or suspected, that her father had been involved in espionage. The details of how Laura had learned this are not entirely clear from available records, but it appears she had overheard conversations or had observed suspicious behavior during visits to her father's home. Laura told her mother that she was considering going to authorities herself and reporting what she knew. This frightened Barbara. She knew that if Laura went to the FBI with vague suspicions and partial information, the investigation might not succeed, and John might find out that his family had attempted to report him. The second factor was Barbara's own conscience. According to her statements to FBI investigators and later to journalists who interviewed her, she had been haunted for years by guilt over her silence. By 1984, her children were all adults. Margaret, the eldest, was 26 and married. Cynthia was 24. Laura was 22. Rachel was 18. They no longer needed protection in the same way they had when they were children. The third factor was more immediate. Barbara had learned that John had recruited their son, Michael, into his espionage activities. This information appears to have come from Laura, who had maintained contact with her younger brother and who had become concerned about his relationship with their father. When Barbara learned that John had brought Michael into his criminal activities, that he had essentially ensured his own son would face espionage charges if the operation was ever exposed, it was the catalyst that finally pushed her to act. The FBI agent who took Barbara Walker's call that afternoon was Walter Price, a counterintelligence specialist at the Boston field office. According to his later report, he initially approached Barbara's allegations with a degree of skepticism. The FBI received many calls from people claiming to have information about espionage, and the vast majority turned out to be baseless or delusional. But as Price questioned Barbara more closely, several factors convinced him that her information was credible. First, she provided specific details: her ex-husband's full name, his Navy service record, the approximate dates when his espionage activities had begun. Second, she described operational details: the photography of documents, the dead drops, the KGB contact that matched known Soviet intelligence procedures. Third, she mentioned Jerry Whitworth and Michael Walker by name as people who were involved in the operation. And fourth, she was not seeking publicity or reward. She seemed genuinely frightened and conflicted about what she was doing. Price told Barbara that he was taking her allegations seriously and that agents would need to interview her in person to gather more detailed information. He advised her not to contact anyone else about the matter, and especially not to contact her ex-husband or any of the other people she had mentioned. Barbara agreed. The following day, November 16, 1984, two FBI counterintelligence agents drove to West Dennis to interview Barbara at her apartment. The interview lasted more than 4 hours. Barbara provided everything she knew: the timeline of John's activities, the names of people involved, descriptions of the dead drop procedures, details about the photography equipment, information about the payments John had received, and her own role as a silent witness to 17 years of espionage. The agents asked Barbara why she had waited so long to come forward. According to the interview transcript, her answer was halting and emotional. She said she had been afraid of her husband, afraid of being prosecuted herself, afraid of what would happen to her children. She said she had been financially dependent on John and had felt trapped by her circumstances and by her religious beliefs about marriage. She said she had been complicit through her silence and that she had been ashamed. She said she had made a terrible mistake by not reporting the espionage in 1968 when she first learned of it, and that she had compounded that mistake by remaining silent for 17 years. The agents assured Barbara that she would not be prosecuted for her silence. While theoretically she could have been charged with misprision of felony, the federal crime of knowing about a felony and failing to report it, prosecutors almost never pursued such charges, particularly against family members of defendants who ultimately cooperated with investigations. The information Barbara provided was forwarded to FBI headquarters in Washington, where it was reviewed by senior counterintelligence officials. The decision was made to open a full espionage investigation with the code name Wind Flyier. The investigation would be conducted by the FBI's Washington field office with support from field offices in Norfolk, Boston, and San Francisco, where Jerry Whitworth was believed to be living. The investigation of John Walker began with careful surveillance and records analysis. FBI agents obtained Walker's military service records, his financial records, his travel history, and records of his business activities since retiring from the Navy. What they found corroborated Barbara's allegations. Walker's financial records showed a pattern of income that was inconsistent with his legitimate sources of revenue. He ran a small business, a detective agency in Norfolk, but the business's declared income was modest. Yet Walker owned a boat, a van, rental properties, and various investments. His lifestyle suggested an income significantly higher than what his business appeared to generate. Agents also found evidence of frequent travel. Walker made regular trips to the Washington, D.C. area, typically once every month or two, These trips appeared to have no clear business purpose. Walker would drive to the Washington suburbs, stay overnight in a motel, and return to Norfolk the following day. Physical surveillance of Walker began in January 1985. Rotating teams of FBI agents documented his movements, photographed his contacts, and noted any unusual behavior. For several weeks, the surveillance produced little of immediate operational value. Walker went to his office, met with clients, attended social events. He appeared to be aware of basic counter-surveillance procedures. He would occasionally drive circuitous routes or make unexpected turns, but he did not seem to believe he was under active investigation. Then, on the evening of May 19, 1985, Walker left his home in Norfolk and drove north toward Washington. FBI surveillance teams followed him, maintaining careful distance to avoid detection. Over the course of the evening, Walker made a series of stops that appeared to be counter-surveillance measures. He drove down dead-end streets and turned around. He parked and waited for extended periods. He made U-turns and doubled back on his route. At approximately 11:30 p.m., Walker stopped at a location on a rural road in Montgomery County, Maryland. He got out of his vehicle, walked a short distance into a wooded area beside the road, and placed a package at the base of a utility pole. The package contained 7 pounds of classified documents that Walker had received from his sources, primarily from Jerry Whitworth and Michael Walker. He marked a nearby highway sign with a piece of tape, a signal to Walker's KGB handler that a dead drop was ready for collection. Then he returned to his vehicle and drove away. FBI agents waited at the location, maintaining surveillance from concealed positions. At approximately 3:20 a.m. on May 20th, a car drove slowly past the dead drop location. The driver appeared to be looking for the signal mark. A few minutes later, the same car returned from the opposite direction and stopped near the utility pole. A man got out, walked quickly to the dead drop location, retrieved Walker's package, returned to his vehicle, and drove away. FBI agents followed the vehicle, which was registered to a Soviet diplomat assigned to the Soviet embassy in Washington. The diplomat's name was Alexei Gavrilovich Tkachenko. He held the official title of Third Secretary, but FBI counterintelligence had long assessed him as a likely KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. Tkachenko drove to the Soviet embassy compound, where he entered through a rear gate. The FBI's surveillance could not penetrate the embassy grounds, but agents had documented the dead drop delivery and retrieval, clear evidence of an active espionage operation. The decision was made to arrest John Walker. On the morning of May 20th, 1985, approximately 5 hours after Tkachenko had retrieved the dead drop, FBI agents arrested John Walker at the Ramada Inn in Rockville, Maryland, where he had been staying overnight. According to the lead agent's report, Walker was in his hotel room when agents knocked on the door at approximately 8:30 a.m. He answered wearing a bathrobe. When agents identified themselves and presented an arrest warrant, Walker's first response was a half-smile and the words, "I've been expecting you guys." Walker was handcuffed, advised of his rights, and transported to the FBI's Washington field office. During the initial interrogation, which began at approximately 11 a.m., Walker exercised his right to remain silent and requested an attorney. FBI agents informed him that they had extensive evidence of his espionage activities, including surveillance documentation of the previous night's dead drop operation. Walker said nothing. A search of Walker's hotel room produced additional evidence. A list of classified documents he had recently received from his sources, cash totaling $18,000, instructions written in code for communicating with his KGB handler, and a sophisticated camera designed for photographing documents. While Walker was being interrogated in Washington, FBI agents in California arrested Jerry Whitworth, and agents in Norfolk arrested Michael Walker. Both men were taken into custody and advised of their rights. Arthur Walker, John's older brother, was arrested several hours later at his home in Virginia. Of the 4 members of the spy ring, Arthur appeared to be the most surprised by the arrest. He had been a relatively minor participant in the operation, and may not have fully understood the extent of his brother's activities or the seriousness of the charges he would face. The arrests were announced publicly on May 21, 1985, in a press conference held by the Department of Justice in Washington. The announcement described the Walker case as one of the most significant espionage cases in American history, and stated that Walker and his co-conspirators had provided the Soviet Union with classified information over a period of nearly 2 decades. The legal proceedings against the 4 members of the Walker spy ring unfolded over the following year. Jerry Whitworth was charged with multiple counts of espionage and conspiracy. His trial, which began in March 1986, produced extensive evidence of the classified materials he had provided to Walker and, through Walker, to the Soviet Union. Whitworth's defense attorney argued that Whitworth had been manipulated by Walker and had not fully understood the consequences of his actions. The prosecution argued that Whitworth was a willing participant who had been paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for his role. On August 28, 1986, Whitworth was convicted on multiple counts and was sentenced to 365 years in prison, the harshest sentence imposed on any member of the spy ring. Michael Walker, John's son, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation included testifying against his father and providing detailed accounts of how he had been recruited and what materials he had provided. Michael's attorney portrayed him as a victim of his father's manipulation, a young man who had idolized his father and had been led into criminal activity by someone he trusted. The prosecution acknowledged Michael's cooperation, but emphasized that he had knowingly betrayed his country. On November 13, 1985, Michael Walker pleaded guilty to espionage charges and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Arthur Walker went to trial and was convicted of espionage charges in August 1985. His contributions to the spy ring had been less extensive than those of his brother John or Jerry Whitworth, but he had still provided classified information to a foreign power. Arthur was sentenced to 3 life sentences plus 40 years. John Walker initially refused to cooperate with investigators. He exercised his right to remain silent and refused to provide details about his espionage activities. However, as the evidence against him mounted and as his co-conspirators began cooperating with prosecutors, his attorneys advised him that cooperation might be his only chance to avoid the death penalty and to secure a reduced sentence for his son, Michael. In October 1985, Walker agreed to a plea bargain. In exchange for pleading guilty to espionage charges and providing full cooperation with investigators, including detailing his espionage activities, identifying his KGB handlers, and explaining his operational procedures, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty and to recommend that his son Michael receive a reduced sentence. Walker's debriefing sessions with the FBI and Navy intelligence officers lasted for months. He provided information about his recruitment by the KGB in 1967, the evolution of the spy ring, the materials he had provided, the dead drop procedures, the payment system, and the identities of his Soviet contacts. Much of this information helped counterintelligence officials understand the extent of the compromise and assess the damage to national security. On November 6, 1986, John Walker was formally sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Judge Alexander Harvey II, in his sentencing remarks, described Walker's espionage as a profound betrayal that had endangered American military personnel and had compromised national security for personal gain. Judge Harvey noted that Walker had not only betrayed his country, but had also corrupted his own son and had destroyed his family through his choices. The damage assessment prepared by the Department of Defense in the aftermath of the Walker case concluded that the compromise was among the most serious in American intelligence history. The specific findings were classified, but unclassified summaries indicated that Walker and his co-conspirators had provided information that allowed the Soviet Union to read virtually all U.S. Navy communications for significant periods during the 1970s and early 1980s. The compromised information included encryption key lists that would have allowed Soviet intelligence to decode operational messages in real time. This meant that during periods of heightened Cold War tensions, including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, various U.S.-Soviet confrontations at sea, and U.S. Navy operations in support of allies around the world, the Soviet Union potentially knew the locations, missions, and communications of American naval vessels. According to statements by senior military officials, the Walker Compromise potentially nullified billions of dollars of investment in communications security systems and forced the Navy to completely overhaul its approach to encryption and operational security. The compromise also raised disturbing questions about how a single individual with relatively modest access had been able to steal and transmit such enormous volumes of classified material over such an extended period without detection. Vitaly Yurchenko, a KGB officer who defected to the United States in 1985 and who later redefected back to the Soviet Union, provided information to American intelligence officials about how highly the KGB valued the Walker information. According to Yurchenko, Walker was considered one of the KGB's most valuable sources of information about American military capabilities, and the intelligence he provided had been distributed to Soviet military planners at the highest levels. In response to the Walker case, the Navy implemented comprehensive new security protocols, more frequent and thorough background investigations, stricter monitoring of the handling of classified materials, and new systems for detecting and preventing the unauthorized removal of documents from secure facilities. The case became a standard example in counterintelligence training programs, studied extensively by professionals seeking to understand how espionage operations function and how they can be detected. For Barbara Walker, the aftermath of her decision to contact the FBI was complex and difficult. On one hand, she was credited with providing the information that led to the exposure of the spy ring. FBI officials and prosecutors acknowledged that without her initial report, the investigation might never have begun, and Walker might have continued his espionage activities indefinitely. On the other hand, Barbara faced intense scrutiny and criticism. Many people questioned why she had waited 17 years to report her ex-husband's espionage. The argument was straightforward. If she had reported John in 1968 when she first learned of his activities, the espionage would have been stopped immediately, and the tremendous damage to national security over the following 17 years would never have occurred. Federal prosecutors decided not to charge Barbara with misprision of felony or with being an accessory to espionage. The decision was based partly on the practical consideration that her cooperation had been essential to the case's success and that prosecuting her would discourage other potential witnesses from coming forward in future cases. But it was also based on a recognition that Barbara's situation had been genuinely difficult and that she had eventually done the right thing, even if belatedly. Barbara gave several interviews to journalists in the years following the case. In these interviews, she consistently expressed regret for not having reported John sooner. She acknowledged that her silence had allowed significant damage to national security. She also spoke about the impact of the case on her relationship with her children. According to Barbara, her daughters had varying reactions to her role in exposing their father. Some understood why she had remained silent for so long and ultimately respected her decision to come forward. Others felt conflicted about whether she should have acted sooner or never reported John at all, despite his crimes. Barbara lived quietly in Massachusetts for the rest of her life. Working in real estate and maintaining a low profile, she declined most interview requests and avoided public attention. She died in 2014 at the age of 76, several months after John Walker's death in prison. John Walker's years in federal prison were spent at various high-security facilities. He was initially incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, and was later transferred to other facilities, including the Federal Correctional Institution in Ashland, Kentucky. Prison records indicate that he maintained relatively good behavior during his incarceration and that he continued to provide information to intelligence officials about espionage tradecraft and Soviet intelligence operations. According to people who knew Walker in prison, including other inmates and correctional officers who were interviewed years later by researchers, he remained largely unapologetic about his espionage activities. He argued that he had not believed his actions would harm individual American military personnel and that he had viewed espionage primarily as a business transaction. He claimed that the damage assessment prepared by the Department of Defense had exaggerated the impact of his espionage for political reasons. Psychologists who had examined Walker as part of the legal proceedings diagnosed him with narcissistic personality traits and an underdeveloped sense of empathy. He appeared to be primarily motivated by money and by the intellectual satisfaction of successfully operating a clandestine operation. John Walker died on August 28, 2014, at the age of 77. He had been incarcerated for 29 years. His death received minimal news coverage, a brief mention in major newspapers and a few longer obituaries in military and intelligence publications that reviewed the Walker case. Jerry Whitworth served 24 years of his 365-year sentence before being released on parole in 2010. He was 72 years old at the time of his release. According to news reports, Whitworth expressed remorse for his role in the spy ring and acknowledged that he had made catastrophic mistakes motivated by financial greed. He lived quietly in California until his death in 2015 at the age of 76. Michael Walker was released from prison on parole in February 2000 after serving 15 years of his 25-year sentence. He was 38 years old. Reintegrating into society after 15 years in federal prison for espionage was extraordinarily difficult. Michael struggled to find employment, struggled with the stigma of his conviction, and struggled with his relationship with what remained of his family. In interviews he gave years after his release, Michael described his recruitment by his father as a pivotal moment that had destroyed his life. He said that at age 22, he had trusted his father completely and had not understood the magnitude of what he was being asked to do. He said that his father had minimized the risks and had presented espionage as a relatively minor transgression. It was only later, after his arrest and during his imprisonment, that Michael came to understand that he had betrayed his country, endangered his shipmates, and thrown away his future. Michael also spoke about the complexity of his feelings toward his father. He had loved John and had wanted his approval, but that bond had been weaponized to recruit him into criminal activity. After his release from prison, Michael maintained minimal contact with his father. Michael Walker lived in Norfolk, working at a series of low-wage jobs. He never married and had no children. By all accounts, he lived a quiet, isolated life, marked by the stigma of his conviction. Arthur Walker was released from prison on parole in May 2002 after serving 17 years. He was 68 years old. Like his nephew Michael, Arthur struggled with reintegration into society. His espionage conviction made employment difficult, and his age compounded the challenge. Arthur gave a single interview to a local newspaper shortly after his release, in which he expressed remorse and stated that he had made terrible choices by agreeing to help his brother John. He died in 2014 at the age of 79, having lived the final years of his life in near poverty and obscurity. The Walker daughters, Margaret, Cynthia, Laura, and Rachel, all dealt with the aftermath of their father's crimes in different ways. According to journalists who interviewed some of the daughters years after the case, the family dynamics were irreparably damaged by the revelations of John's espionage and by the arrests that followed. Margaret, the eldest, had been 27 when her father was arrested. She was married with children of her own by that time and had established some distance from her dysfunctional family of origin. Margaret maintained minimal contact with her father after his arrest and did not visit him in prison. She changed her last name to distance herself from the Walker name's association with treason. Cynthia, who had been 25 at the time of the arrests, struggled significantly with depression and anxiety in the years following the case. She felt shame about what her father had done, anger that he had chosen espionage over his family, and betrayal over her mother's long silence, though she ultimately understood the impossible position Barbara had been in. Laura, who had been the catalyst for Barbara's decision to contact the FBI, carried guilt about the consequences of that decision. Even though she understood intellectually that her father's crimes were his responsibility and that exposing him had been the right thing to do, she still struggled emotionally with the fact that her concerns had led to her father's life imprisonment. Laura had a difficult relationship with both of her parents in the years following the case. Rachel, the youngest, had been 19 when her father was arrested, old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough that her adult identity was still being formed. Rachel had maintained a relationship with her father during her teenage years and had not suspected that he was involved in espionage. The revelation of his crimes forced her to completely reevaluate her understanding of who her father was and what their relationship had meant. All four daughters struggled with the question of whether they should maintain contact with their father after his imprisonment. Visiting him in prison meant confronting what he had done and dealing with his lack of genuine remorse. Not visiting him meant abandoning their father, regardless of his crimes. The family was fractured by trauma, shame, and conflicting loyalties, a family that could never fully recover from the damage that John's choices had caused. Looking back at the Walker case from a perspective of several decades, what emerges most clearly is the profound human cost of espionage, not just to national security in the abstract, but to specific individuals whose lives were destroyed or permanently damaged by choices they made or by choices made by people they trusted. John Walker chose to betray his country for money and out of a misguided sense that his actions would not cause real harm. Those choices led directly to his spending the last 30 years of his life in federal prison, dying at age 77, having lost everything: his freedom, his family, any legacy beyond that of traitor. Barbara Walker chose to remain silent about her husband's espionage for 17 years, believing she was protecting her children and herself. That choice haunted her for the rest of her life. When she finally did come forward, she was simultaneously credited with breaking the case and criticized for not having acted sooner. Her decision to report John, which she knew would result in his imprisonment and potentially in her son Michael's imprisonment as well, was an act of moral courage. But it was also an implicit acknowledgment that her earlier silence had been wrong. Michael Walker chose to trust his father and to participate in espionage when he was 22 years old. That choice cost him 15 years in federal prison and permanently destroyed any chance he had for a normal life. He was simultaneously a victim of his father's manipulation and an adult who made choices and who bore responsibility for those choices. The Walker daughters had no choice in any of it. They were children growing up in a dysfunctional family who eventually learned that their father was a traitor and that their mother had known about it for years. They dealt with shame, confusion, anger, and the impossible question of what loyalty meant when your father was a spy and your mother had concealed his crimes. The American military personnel whose communications were potentially compromised by Walker's espionage, sailors on submarines, officers planning operations, analysts assessing threats, had no knowledge that their encrypted messages might be readable by the Soviet Union. They trusted the security systems that were supposed to protect their communications. That trust was betrayed by someone who held a position specifically designed to safeguard classified information. The question of responsibility in cases like the Walker case is complicated because it requires us to assign moral weight to choices made by different people operating under different circumstances with different information and different options. John Walker bears primary responsibility for choosing to commit espionage. Barbara bears some degree of responsibility for remaining silent about criminal activity she knew was occurring. Michael bears responsibility for choosing to participate when recruited by his father. But all of these choices were made within systems and contexts that shaped what seemed possible, attractive, or necessary. John Walker's initial decision to approach the Soviet embassy in 1967 was made in a context of financial desperation, personal unhappiness, and opportunity. Barbara's decision to remain silent in 1968 was made in a context of economic dependence, religious conviction about marriage, and genuine fear. Michael's decision to participate in 1983 was made in a context of familial loyalty, trust in his father, and youthful poor judgment. None of these contexts excuse the choices that were made, but understanding the contexts helps us understand how ordinary people, not monsters, not heroes, just people, can make catastrophic choices that destroy lives and damage nations. The Walker case is often cited as one of the most damaging espionage cases in American history. The classified information that was compromised, the operational capabilities that were potentially neutralized, the billions of dollars that had to be spent repairing the damage, all of this was significant. But perhaps the most profound damage was to the human beings directly involved. The family destroyed, the children traumatized, the lives wasted in federal prisons, the guilt and shame and regret that marked everyone connected to the case. John Walker was 30 years old when he first walked into the Soviet embassy in December 1967. He was 48 when he was arrested in May 1985. He was 77 when he died in federal prison in August 2014. For 18 of those years, he committed espionage. For 29 of those years, he was imprisoned for it. And throughout all of those years, he seems to have never fully understood or acknowledged the magnitude of the harm he caused, not just to national security in the abstract, but to his wife, his children, his brother, his son, and to everyone else whose lives intersected with his betrayal. The telephone call that Barbara Walker made on November 15, 1984, changed everything. It exposed a spy ring, it led to arrests and convictions, it allowed counterintelligence officials to assess damage and implement reforms, but it also finalized the destruction of a family that had been damaged for decades by secrets, lies, and impossible choices. There are no heroes in the Walker story. There are only people making choices under difficult circumstances, trying to balance competing obligations, rationalizing actions they knew were wrong, and then living with consequences they often did not fully anticipate. The complexity of human motivation, the weight of systemic pressures, the impossibility of protecting everyone, the inadequacy of simple moral frameworks when confronting real human situations, all of these are present in the Walker case. And at the center of it all is a single phone call from a woman who had kept a secret for 17 years and who finally decided that the secret had to be told, whatever the cost to her family, to herself, or to the memory of a marriage that had ended in failure long before the law finally caught up with the man she had once loved.